misconceptions around AI, but perhaps the most fundamental one is that it's in some sense an inexorable technological development over which we as individuals or as societies can exert very little control. But that's manifestly false because it's a terrain where human choices are constantly being made. For example, the choice as to it serves those who do make these choices, those who are currently in power in the existing status quo, to disguise that fact by presenting them as unalterable facts of nature. And I think that is a misconception we have to constantly fight against and highlight the fact that this is a domain of choice, whose choices are being made here, which values, really important questions we have to constantly stress. The question of which are the values that we want AI to further, and secondly, what is the best institutional mechanism to ensure that it does further those values. So on the question of values, I think there are some serious misconceptions, and in particular, there's a tendency to identify human values with actual preferences of people. And that to me is a deep mistake, because preferences are just facts about people. These facts, these preferences could be based on false information. They could reflect various prejudices, racist, sexist, and so forth. The point of ethics is to subject our preferences to critical scrutiny. And on the institutional front, I think a really important question is how do we secure some kind of genuine democratic control over AI developments? I think that is really crucial. And on a more positive front, how might it be possible to use AI to enrich our democratic culture? For example, to enable more radical forms of citizen participation amongst the citizenry that often feels alienated by developments and feels that its voice isn't heard. I think for a long time there was this misconception that somehow corporations, big tech, would be at the forefront of development. And clearly that idea is a non-starter even before the recent scandals affecting ethics, in-house ethics in big tech corporations. I think that the driver for thought about AI ethics and governance has to be a vibrant civil society that is inclusive and engages in informed debate. And universities have a very important role to play, I think, partly because of their academic independence, although that is a precious thing that is constantly under threat and something we constantly have to fight to preserve, partly because universities have the capability to facilitate the kind of multidisciplinary discussion that is absolutely necessary in this area. But above all, I think what I want to say is academics have a special obligation to model civil and rational debate for a wider citizenry about contentious ethical questions. And if we can't engage in such debate, then it seems to me, given that we're in such privileged circumstances, there is little hope for people outside the university sphere to engage in such debate. It's a temptation for everyone to read their own political prejudices into the COVID pandemic and into the often inept response of governments to that pandemic. What I would say at a very general level is that the pandemic illustrates or casts into sharp relief a certain question, and that question is, in the service of which values and which interests is AI being developed? Is it being developed in the service of profit making, and often in a way that involves manipulating or exploiting people's preferences or beliefs, often in ways that perhaps violate their human right to privacy or violate their right to political participation? Or is it being developed in a way that, for example, serves basic human interests and rights, for example, the right to be in a safe working environment or the right of access to life-saving vaccines? I think we have a serious problem here. The answers to those questions are not particularly encouraging at the moment. Philosophy has an important role to play. Philosophers cannot resolve these questions. We don't have the political authority to do so. And contrary to Plato, we should not be given the political authority to do so. But I think that philosophy is well placed to highlight two things at least. So the first thing philosophers are well placed to highlight is that these ethical questions are subject to rational investigation, discussion, and debate. That it's not simply a domain for sort of PR manipulation or simply a domain for power plays, that we can have a rational debate about value questions. So that is perhaps the most fundamental thing. But another thing I think philosophers are well placed to do is to highlight the fact that these ethical issues do not reduce to one fundamental question, for example, a question of trustworthiness or a question of human rights, that there are many different ethical considerations, that they often conflict. And I think philosophy can do a great service in highlighting that fact and getting us away from some straitjacket conception that there is one master concept that solves all these problems. That's a very difficult question. It no doubt is changing us and will change us. It's very hard to predict how. So instead of predicting, I'll just simply express my fear that I have. And my deepest fear about AI is that it will be corrosive of human dignity. Our dignity as human beings, what makes us distinctively valuable, is our capacity, both as individuals and as groups, to engage in rational self-determination, to be sensitive to rational considerations for and against various courses of conduct, and to make a choice in light of a rational assessment. And my worry is that AI might become harnessed to a wider tendency, a tendency encouraged by capitalism, to turn us all into passive consumers who, in a sense, delegate rational decision-making to autonomous systems.